Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kevin Aline, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The Biden administration announced new actions to counter racial and ethnic bias in home valuations. Joining me to dissect racial inequalities within New York City home ownership is licensed real estate salesperson Adan Morales and Vanessa Villanueva of the Mora Via LLC. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, the White House is finally addressing the issue of racial bias within home ownership, but this has been an ongoing issue for Black Americans for decades. For those who don't know, can you give a little background on the severity of this issue?
So I have two examples that I wanted to give you guys, and I'm going to get into a little bit of detail, but not nothing too crazy. One of them is restrictive deeds. So even in the state of New York, even in the Bronx, Manhattan, within the boroughs, as late even in the 1940s and 50s, you could still find certain language in the deed that would say something along the lines of that if this home is to be sold, that it could not be sold to a person of color. That's one example of how intrinsic this was within the system. This language was in the deed, and it was put there specifically to not allow for people of color to move into particular neighborhoods. Another example that is obviously a great example is the red line maps. So imagine a map of the Bronx that was divided and color coded into different sections that would identify where would be the most what would be the best place to live. So this was done through an A, B, C, D system where they would put from first grade all the way to fourth grade in terms of quality. You would see, for example, in a map that I had observed in 1938, you would see that the only area in the entire Bronx that even got the color green, which was first grade, was Riverdale. After that, you started seeing a little bit of blue and a lot of yellow. And if you looked at areas, for example, like the South Bronx, like Hunts Point and Mott Haven, those areas were red, meaning that they were undesirable and that it was much more complicated and difficult to get a loan there. That's two good examples of how far back these issues go, even within our state itself.
Wow. Well, we'll soon have a task force to address the problem of home appraisals. Can you first explain what home appraisals are and then how are Black and Brown communities being affected by this?
So when someone's going into a real estate transaction, there's two things that are being evaluated, right? The person that's trying to take the loan, and they're being evaluated personally for their credit, their income, and their savings. And then there's the evaluation of the property. So after a deal goes into contract, the bank orders what's called an appraisal, and that is when a representative that is hired by the bank comes over to the property, analyzes it, and gives the bank their opinion on what the value of that property is. And this has a huge impact on what happens after that point, because this is going to determine the most that the bank is willing to lend in regards to that property. And remember that they're already in contract when this occurs. Now, in regards to how this affects the community, it really comes down to cause and effect, right? Um, what has happened over the last 100 years, and even what has happened recently with appraisals are causes, right? And what are the effects of that? And the effects of that are that people are being impacted not only in the homes that they're trying to buy, they're also being impacted when it comes to refinance, right? Because another time that appraisal is used is during a refi. So let's say you want to draw on some of that equity, some of that wealth that your family has built, and you're going to be the amount of wealth that you have is going to be determined in some ways by that appraisal. There's a lot of things going on right now with Freddie Mac. One of the things that I had heard discussed was that they were considering going over to remote appraisals, which means that the appraisal won't actually happen in person. It'll be done over a computer by using more statistics and analytics. And the hope of this is to hope that there are going to be less biases involved because it's just numbers, it's just statistics. However, one of the strategies that they're considering is only proposing a remote desktop appraisal when a down payment is made of 10% or more. Now, I spend so much time on this topic because it's really important to understand this, right? So if you look at the National Association of Realtors, they do a study every year. In 2021, the majority of people that purchased a home for the first time took out a loan that was 93% value of the property. That means that on average, a first time home buyer was not putting down more than 7%. And if they were to go forward with the 10% example, anybody that, for the most part, is a first time home buyer is going to be subject to an in person appraisal. Whereas someone that perhaps has a little bit more money to put down and puts in 10 or more has that possibility of getting it done remotely. Now, if you look at the statistics of who are first-time home buyers and who are people that are selling to buy,
Hmm.
there's big disparities there, and that's why we're having this conversation. Because if you're only going to give it to the people that are less than 10%, then there's going to be some issues with that, in my professional opinion.
So, kind of addressing that, the current administration is releasing the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Action Plan, aimed to dismantle racial bias in the home lending and appraisal process. Vanessa, I would like to hear from you. What were your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I definitely think it's a move in the right direction because it addresses something that hasn't been spoken about or addressed too often, but that for the most part, it is something that is known. It is something that has happened, and I'm definitely looking forward to some of that being cleared or having somewhat of a clear slate. And like Adon mentioned, it being more of a neutralized space because it should just be based on numbers, statistics, comparables or comps, like we call it in the industry, and really just be a more neutralized space
It's the beginning of a conversation.
for sure.
Now, here in New York, people often think of New York City as a melting pot, but when it comes to home ownership in New York City, the Center for NYC Neighborhoods found that areas with a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic homeowners have lower home values, even if the age and square footage of their properties are exactly the same. Now, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but can you just explain how this is actually really affecting these communities and how we're seeing this racial disparity?
Yes, absolutely. So, to start off with the idea of home ownership and understanding that, for example, in the Bronx is one of the areas in the entire country that has the lowest rate of home ownership, which means that more people in the Bronx are renting and they're tenants than are owners and landowners. And that is going to have a direct impact on the overall community. And in regards to the underappreciation, the impact is that if more people in one area are of the same type, let's say Black, Latino minorities, right? Then and they're the ones that are being underappreciated. Then where they go on next, there's going to be a trickle effect, right? Because if let's say they are selling, they're getting less for what they're selling. Therefore, they have less buying power moving forward.
Well, I mean, and to kind of add to that, the idea or the ideology is that people who own take better care of their community, right? They see more value and have a better appreciation for their neighborhood. So it definitely is something where if you see value in it, you're going to take better care.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, I notice in these conversations, the topic of generational wealth comes up a lot. And in regards to generational wealth, you've actually partnered with the organization Strive Higher to educate different generations about money and real estate. Why was that important for the both of you?
So it was actually very important for Adon and I to collaborate with like-minded organizations and affiliates because it's just something we're truly passionate about. We talk to our son about these sort of conversations, and I think just within our communities, culturally, it's always been a big taboo to talk about income, to talk about credit, money. Right, you stray away from those things, and I think it's so important to start having those conversations much earlier on so that it allows for them for the children to know that there's something more out there, that there's ways to achieve it, there's sources and credible and safe people to have these conversations with. So kind of just throwing those seeds in so that as they get older they can really appreciate what they're working so hard to.
And I think a clear depiction of that is that the average American that owns a home has a net worth of 100,000 or so, whereas the average tenant in America has a net worth of under 10,000. So imagine the impact on that disparity When you multiply that by 2, 3, or 5 generations in, that family's sitting on somewhere along $500,000 of net worth. And any generation after that's going to have that leg up.
And show them how to appreciate and care for it and how to maintain it.
Exactly.
So once it's their turn to collect in on that inheritance, they'll know what to do with it.
And can you actually tell us a little bit more about the workshops that your organization provides?
Sure. So we provide homeowner workshops in both English and Spanish. We align ourselves with organizations that also host these workshops. They are almost always free, and now with everything going remote, they're also available virtually as well. We're also familiar with a lot of the New York State and city programs for down payment assistance. And we work with a lot of lenders that are also, whether they're offering grants as well or familiar with these, we work all together on the choosing the goal.
Yeah, it's all about partnering. So, like the one that we just did on Saturday, we were able to partner, obviously, with Strive Higher with Olga and her amazing organization. We also partnered with the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, as well as with Chase Bank. And we're just trying to bring as many people on board that have something to say about generational wealth and bringing and spreading that word.
All right, well, thank you both so much for joining us. If you look at your screen, you can actually see their social media, so you can stay in contact with this organization. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
so
having
much.
us.
Take
Bye.
care.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.